Okay, I think it's time to get started. Everybody's here. Bruce is here, our main presenter. Want to thank you all for being here. To our family, see a lot of familiar faces, and welcome to the people who've never been to any of our events before. Our goal is just try to improve the profession and save our butt for the future. Bruce's head is shaking. Yes. All right. Next month we're going to have Steve Smith. We'll be talking about non-lender appraisal work. I've known him for many years. He's gone through 3 cycles and does the same stuff every 10 or 12 years. How to get out of doing just loan appraisals. And then the month after March, Isaac Peck from OREP. Okay, and this is our teddy bear who welcomes you. And how did this happen? This is me. It's a whole bunch of circumstances. Won't go into that, but I got a whole pile of education and things like econometrics and statistics and math and finance and computer programming even. And I had no idea what I was doing back then was studying data science. And this is Bruce. Bruce is also an approved instructor for the stats, graphs, and data science class. I'll leave that up there just long enough you can barely read it. We want to kind of move along today, leave as much time for Bruce as possible. The topic of motivation and sales and finance, I think Bruce has got some really good angles on this. It's going to become a more and more important topic as we go. I have a feeling that we may be repeating this particular webinar 6 or 8 months from now, and there'll be 3 times as many people here because then it's going to come roost on us. So current issues, what do we got going? Well, we're talking about bias and diversity. I'm going to do about 15, 20 minutes here, and then I'll turn it over fully to Bruce. So valuation alternatives, of course. We started writing about an excess of appraisers when everybody thought, ha, 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 giggle, giggle, when everybody else is talking about the shortage of appraisers. Happens every cycle. The environment for valuation is changing, the technology in particular, and bank things. Technology is changing everything and already is changing what the needs are for the expert. That's you and me. Certainly a need for objective data selection instead of just trust me, I know a good comp when I see one. Recognition of uncertainty. That's something that we as a science, theoretically, a numerical science type of profession kind of ignore. And the measurement of risk and reliability, which is what our clients actually really need. The red arrow there is about the changed valuation environment. That'll be primarily what we're talking about today, and certainly everything that Bruce is focused on. Our mission is to connect your special expertise with the potential of today's data science tools. What is science? It's a systematic study by an expert, that's you and me, in the field of study, valuation. So our job is to connect that. Primarily, it's a movement towards objective evidence versus subjective judgment. Objective means free of bias. By the way, I wrote this long before the topic of racial bias, that type of, and personal bias came into I was talking about analytic bias, not personal bias. However, they do overlap. And if you want to lie and be biased, you really got to know good biased analytics. Oh boy, I better stop. Based on facts rather than conjecture. Subjective means not impartial, based on your opinions and feelings rather than facts and evidence, based on belief or believability. Unfortunately, the standards to which we have to comply focus completely on the word credibility, which USPAP defines as worthy of belief. And I really believe we have to move on from that, go to the concept of reliability, not believability. Okay, Fannie and Freddie's, where are they at? This last year and a half, I've gone to conferences with both Lyle Radke from Fannie Mae, and that's what he said. I'll just let you read it. And then Freddie Mac at a different conference, Scott Reuter said, appraisers need to spend time on developing a market conditions analysis and appraisal. It's truly the backbone of the appraisal. And if you've been on my class, you know that we really focus on market price indexing and time adjustments and getting them. If you get the data right, and the rest of everything else pretty much falls in place. The expert in the computer. Your job as the expert is to get the right model. Like, is it the cost approach, the income approach, sales comparison approach? Algorithm is the computer carrying out the choice of models that you had. I'm going through this really quickly because I want to kind of set the table for Bruce's presentation. It's just what I always do. What do our clients want, and what are we supposed to be doing? Well, this far left one is biased. Is it biased because of personal bias, or is it biased because of analytic bias? You picked the wrong model. Well, we don't know, but that's everything's up to one side, and it's not on the bullseye. This is true. You're going around the true answer, but you're not very sure of it. That's what I meant by reliability. This is accurate, but it's not reliable. This is both accurate and reliable, both true and sure. So this could be a biased appraiser, or it could be a biased analysis. It could be a careless new appraiser, or somebody who just doesn't care, or a low fee ballpark. I don't need an exact number, just give me a low fee, but give me an answer. But it's really difficult for us to do that type of work because of the way USPAP is and the expectations of us. So true and sure is really the goal, but given cost, it may not always be exactly right. It depends on the fee, or should. Certainly what I do for loan work is far different than what I do for litigation work in terms of fee. It has to do with the depth and the breadth of the analysis I do. So what is market analysis? Well, appraisal is market analysis. It's been said many times, and we tend to forget that. It's a process for examining supply and demand for a specific market segment. So we got to answer the questions: what market segment? And how do you define it? How do you delineate it? What are the dimensions of what's truly the competitive market segment? And given that market segment, what is the trend in that segment, and is it changing? And we've certainly experienced that the last 6 months or a year, changing markets. I've got a couple of graphs that demonstrate that in particular neighborhood in San Diego. 2 parts to the analysis in using data science method. It's a 5-step process. We separate selecting the data from making adjustments. In the past, traditional appraisal, we've merged those together. Data science method, or evidence-based valuation, we separate those 2 thinking processes. But today we're focusing on evidencing the data, and that's what Bruce will be primarily talking about. So what's the one big thinking change relative to data? Well, in traditional appraisal versus data science method. Traditional appraisal, we gather a few comps, pick some comps, and compare those comps. In data science, we download all the data we think we'll ever need, and then we chip away at it till we get to the right data set, down to the subject property. Why are graphs? Why do we use graphs so much? Well, the human brain really responds to graphs. One picture is worth 10,000 words. Humans are very good visually. The brain just doesn't do well beyond 3 or 4 comps. We're not restricted by forms anymore. The manner of delivering electronically has changed, and is going to change a lot more in the near future, in the next 2, 3, 4 years for sure. And remember, most market segments aren't 3 competitive sales, and sometimes they're less than 3. So how often is it just 3? That's one of the things we talk about in the stats, graphs, and data science class, is what's the right data set? What do you include? What do you not include? So if you had to put that in a few words, in evidence-based valuation, what we teach is we measure markets, we don't compare comps. That's 6 words? 6 words describes the difference. Overall process from beginning to end. Well, we download all the data that we think might possibly be useful for us. We explore it using graphs, visuals. I'll show you some examples of it very quickly here. We identify the part of the market that's competitive, directly competitive to your subject property. It involves judgment. This is not EVM stuff. This is how do you use your appraiser experience, but leverage the technology that's out there. And then apply the 3 predictive methods. There's 3 of them. and position the subject property within that particular market segment. And you deliver a documented report called an enhanced data stream. No more reports per se, not the way we're used to it. Graphs, different graphs serve different purposes. There's a bar chart, just simply a visual representation of any number or numbers. A box plot, the two ends of the whiskers here. So if this was prices in a particular area, that would be the highest price. This would be the lowest price. The middle line here is the median. That's the median sale price of that data set. And the box is the middle 50% of the sales are between that number and that number. Histogram, so this is a good way of describing any data set, including a neighborhood or a market segment. A histogram gives you a little more detail, but it's the same information, but a different way of looking at it. So you can see the exact same data gives your eyes and your brain different information how to look at that. So we deal a lot with graphs, how to train your brain to understand what the data, let the data speak to your brain. And a scatter plot, the core part of market price indexing, measures two variables. In this case, the x-axis here is the date of sale or date of closing, and on the y-axis here is the sale prices. And each of these dots is a sale in this given market segment. And with that, we then apply a simple regression line that gives us a trend for time adjustment. Without going into detail, basically what we teach, once you've got the software right, you got it working with your data set, your MLS, your CoStar, it takes literally seconds for you to create that and plug it into your report. And it's very reliable, very reliable. We use the 5 dimensions of similarity. When Bruce gets into his presentation, he'll talk about the 4 components or parts of market. I can't remember the words. I used to teach that stuff.
Market analysis.
Yeah, okay. Governmental, social, financial, yeah, that kind of stuff. But the way we define market segments is using these 5 dimensions of similarity. Property type and rights, transaction elements. Transaction has nothing to do with the property. It has to do with the contract between the buyer and the seller and the lender, people involved. Then, of course, time, the spatial stuff, location, and then finally, those preferences. Once you're inside a competitive market segment, different people have different preferences, so and they compete with those. So those are the 5 dimensions of similarity. The reason we call them 5 dimensions is because it enables some of our wonderful technological analysis. So I'm not going to talk about this much, but the property type, transaction, time, how far back do you go? Answer those questions, creates a price index, spatial stuff, and the preferences. What Bruce will be talking about today, the whole topic today, is about the transaction elements that have little or nothing to do with the property. Has to do with the buyer and the seller and the lender, the people that are actually participating contractually. Is that a right way of putting it, Bruce? All right, good. So 3 basic adjustment methods that we teach. With all the hubbub we got about making adjustments, improving adjustments, it's a lot of BS in my opinion. Boy, am I getting brave here. But really it comes down to 3 basic types of some of the people have known have been part of our family here for years. They're the ones that laugh the loudest when I say stupid stuff here. But basically, there's really 3 basic types of adjustment support: contrasting, association, and sequencing. Contrasting compares 2 groups, very similar to the group pair comparison that you may or may not have learned in the past from appraisal classes. Association, we generally use simple regression, relates one variable to another variable. And then sequencing, putting things in order. Some things are better or worse. I do a lot of view litigation work. The human brain is really good at telling a better view from a worse view, but terrible at trying to put a number to it. So price indexing, which is the core tool that we teach in the beginning classes, uses association and simple regression. Our job is to get the right market segment. You get the right data, everything falls in place right. So here's an example. This indicates a downward trend for the neighborhood of $145 a day. That's this number here. But notice, is this a good competitive market segment? Look, it goes from 200,000 up to 600,000. That's too broad. Neighborhood is not a good trend measure. We reduce that down to the data, the sales that compete directly with the subject property. That's the time adjustment we want. That's the one thing we can do that economists can't do, newspaper writers can't do, the data putter together people can't do. This is where we shine over everybody else. Getting the competitive market segment. Here's another example of it. The line is a simple regression line. Behind that line is there's a formula, and that formula gives you the time adjustment if the straight line looks good. And it's just pure math. This is a neighborhood that I use a lot in the StatsGraphs data science class. I thought, what the heck, let me just run that. And this was just around December, I ran that when things were falling off the cliff. Look at this. It's going pretty steady. And then it dropped like a 15-20% here in about six months. It was this is a huge drop off. But Bruce will be talking about one thing. I want you to notice something about the dots. Pretty steady here. The frequency, how many sales are going on over time, is pretty good. And over here is fairly busy. But look at this. There's almost like a gap in here. Craig Gilbert's online here. Craig, are you there? If you are, wave your hand. Oh, I don't see him. Oh, there. Okay. Well, we got too many people on here. Yeah, Craig has done a couple of webinars here with us. And one of the things Craig and I independently discovered, and we were on a webinar like this talking about that, and we both came up with this concept that when a market's about to change, you get this hesitation. The market slows down. And I know Bruce will talk about a broker he was just talking to, but when he starts talking about that, that's what we're talking about there. The market velocity, how many transactions are going on, suddenly slow down. It's like people magically talk to each other and hesitate. And here's the kind of the end of that curve on a smaller market segment that shows that a particular smaller segment at the end of that last graph you saw is starting to turn around. It was headed down here and then started going up. So this is a second order polynomial curve. This is two histograms. I mean, two box plots put together. Box plots are really great for comparing two groups, the contrasting. This is one neighborhood. This is another neighborhood right across the freeway, just a couple of thousand feet away. And yet there's this huge difference between Mira Mesa and Scripps Ranch, even though we've controlled for and held constant or grouped the property features on both sides of the freeway. So I'm going to do this. I wasn't going to do this before, but this is one of my earliest methods. It ties right into what Bruce will be doing here in a few seconds. Quantifying motivation. At that time, I had a client who had a phone room, and they worked with many of the affordable areas of San Diego. This is like 3 cycles ago, folks, when I did a lot of houses. And almost 15 to 20% of the houses in the neighborhoods, there's one neighborhood, were REOs, bank-owned properties. So I was trying to figure out, how do I measure the motivation? Well, the traditional context out of the Appraisal Institute didn't help me at that time. I mean, in a very general way it did, but so this is one of my earliest efforts that really showed the value of doing this. Some of my best comps, there was a comp right across the street. It just sold, but it was owned by a bank, and my brain is telling me I'm an appraiser. I think I sold too low. So I was desperately looking, how do I support an adjustment for a bank-owned property? I know they're selling faster. So all I had back then, we don't have anywhere near the technical software capabilities as we did back then, but I did have the MLS online. Remember, when I first became an appraiser, we didn't have no online internet stuff. You had books that came out every 3 months. And yellow highlighters were still new back then. You highlighted the ones that looked like good comps. It was very clumsy. So I did have an MLS. I wanted to compare disposition motivated sales to the market motivated sales. And I did what economists do. They search for a stand-in variable or a substitute variable. So I was looking for what one field in the MLS database that I had, what would represent a motivated sale? And I scratched my head for weeks on that. And finally, it occurred to me there was a field back then called OCC, occupant. And the brokers had three choices. They could mark it as VAC, vacant, TEN, tenant, or OWN, owner. So I started comparing the owners with the vacants, two groups. And I thought, okay, if I compare them, I'm controlling for the same property, size, living area. This is a very homogeneous area. It was easy to do this at. So the variable vacant acts as a surrogate or a stand-in for sale condition. As you can see, I'm segueing into the title of this presentation and what Bruce will be doing here. I didn't have any other variable that helped me. It'll extract as much information as I can from the data I've got, even though I know it's not perfect, but it's a big help. So I'm going to go through these very quickly. This is the way things were done back in those. I had to do a CMA market analysis, did an area market survey. I did control in this particular case for the preference of living area from 1,200 to 1,700 square foot and a range of market dates of about 6 months. And I controlled it for just vacant sales, and I got a number. Then I did the same thing. Well, here's my results. The median price is 163,000. The mean is 157. So that's for all the vacant houses that were primarily bank owned, using the stand-in variable. This means occupant, not vacant. So it would have been tenants or owners, not vacant. And I got a median of 169.9 and a mean of 165. Compare those two groups. Look at this. Vacant, median is 163, occupied 170. $7,000 difference, basically. And almost the same difference between the two means. So I got a median difference of 7,000, a mean difference of 7,000. I called it 7,000 between those two, but I was still nervous, folks. I said, boy, this can't be this good. So I took another way of looking at that. If I'm a bank owner, I mean a bank. If I'm working in a bank and it's my job to get rid of this property, am I motivated to get rid of it? Yeah, sure. Once a week, my boss comes and looks over my shoulder and says, "You get rid of that property yet? We're not in the business of owning houses," and it costs them money. So what does it cost them? Well, it costs them 3 months interest. These are very representative of that time. Cost them some money to keep track of the property, maintain it, a little bit of management. So I called it the cost method of what does it cost the bank to not. But consider, and I did this for a period of years, literally. I kept coming up with this kind of a difference. Well, why? And I figured it out finally. The difference was that boss hanging over the person's shoulder that's responsible for getting rid of that house. Kind of an inverse motivation, inverse entrepreneurship. Get rid of that house. So that's the bank motivation in addition to their costs. And it supported, throwing that in there kind of really helped my reasoning. I've applied this methodology for SBA financing, for location in 2 different areas, any major physical amenities, like is on a railroad siding or not, number of parking spaces for a high-rise condominium, any continuous measure you can put into a category. Critical thinking. Basically, it's thinking about your own brain. What does my brain do and don't do? Am I biased? Today, I guess the context is, am I biased? We have to ask that question. I've all along thought we as professionals need to do that. Think about it. So here's critical thinking skills. Aren't these things that we appraisers responsible for doing right there? Reasoning, evaluating, problem solving, decision making, analyzing. That's critical thinking. So, and in the classes, so we've gone completely over to using R and R Studio, which is a very broad, hugely used analytics package all over the world. Very flexible, very powerful, very good at graphs. And we continue to get better at using it and teaching it also in the class. There's a huge global community of user developers that's creating free online packages and programs. We have a community of asset analysts, which is a group strictly of appraisers. We're more than 200 strong already. There's 3 or 4 of us right here on this webinar. Thank you for being here. Later on, when we go into the Q&A in next hour, then some of those people feel free to jump in with answers. We help with each other with learning and sharing of reusable algorithms. And of course, the theory behind all of this is important. The modeling decisions that you have to make as an appraiser. So R is a tool, it's a community, and it's your competence blended in with your appraisal experience. Here's a quick example of R in our studio. You got the four panes. The upper left is like a word processor. The bottom left is the console, what the computer does. The upper pane here keeps track of everything you do simultaneously. And this is the miscellaneous thing, including graphs. So it looks just something like this. I'm going to move on very quickly here. So there's a basic R Studio. And it takes advantage of today's screens, the high resolution, the big screen that you have on your desk. It takes advantage of that. You got 4 things going on all the time. All you got to do is move your eyes. You don't have to close a piece of software, reopen another one, copy, paste it in there, and then go back. Everything's done in a split second instead of taking minutes. In the class, we talk about how to download your data and put it in a reasonable order so that it works very well. In particular, relative to the price index, and we emphasize that you should put the data sale and the sale price right next to each other, because you can do a very quick and dirty price index in literally about 10 seconds if you put those 2 columns next to each other. You don't even have to use R. If you're really an expert in Excel, you can do it in Excel too. It only takes you about a minute instead of 10 seconds. Breaking news, just decided that this morning. We're planning a 7-hour online class for any of you who have ever been in stats, graphs, and data science over the last 17 years. This will be free to you to bring you up to date on what we do with R. It'll be our intention is to have this fully free for all graduates of Stats and Graphs Data Science 1. If you subscribe to the Asset Analyst Report, which is a couple of $100 a year, also free to you, and $49 for all others. Please help us cover some of our hard costs of putting stuff on. Here's our studio again. You can just happen to do black on white instead of white on black. So thank you. And that is the end of my introductory part. I will turn it over to Bruce.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, George.
You ready?
Okay, let me share my screen. And I've got to start by saying it's good to see a lot of familiar faces here. There are some people here that are smarter than me. So if at any point along the way you have a question or a comment, feel free. And if Greg, John, George, and Cindy would interrupt me, I promise you I won't do a very good job following the chat. I just fail at that miserably. So if you have a question, I'm good with that. We could save them till the end, or you can feel free to ask them midway. I don't have a problem with that. Let's just dig in and talk about the market, where we're at, and probably things that we need to start thinking about probably already. And how do we deal with distressed markets, sales, and the conditions that come with it? I would say there are a lot of different types of distress in real estate.
Bruce, are you putting something on the screen?
Yeah, am I not sharing?
I don't get it.
I can see it.
Okay.
Oh, you can. I don't know what's wrong with mine then.
Long as
Go to the bottom.
Oh, okay, I got it.
Oh.
Yeah. But I'll
okay.
yeah,
So,
we have a couple of people here who are helping. If you want to put questions on the chat as we go, just plug them in there. Click on the chat function down at the bottom of your screen, and John Ferris can help, and oh, there's 3 or 4 people that can help us keep track on that. Thank you. Go, okay, I'll shut up.
No, you're fine. So three types of distress within real estate. I mean, property can be distressed for a variety of reasons. some long-term, some short-term. And financial conditions can definitely distress a piece of real estate. George just illustrated the impacts of an REO property. Short sale as we move into tougher market conditions is something we'll probably see again, I would bet. A construction defect or some sort of problem that needs to be repaired at great expense usually doesn't occur right away. That can distress a property. A property can get contaminated with something. If you listen to the news and believe everything that's said, that is it East Palestine, Ohio, may have some contaminated properties. If you work there, that happens. So a property can be distressed. People can be distressed. People can have financial issues. People can be distressed from something that's going on with the property. People can lose their job, not have that money to continue to service their debt. People get a medical problem and aren't able to work or have such huge costs they can't make their payment. That is people distress that can cause properties to have distress. And of course, markets can be distressed. And we'll talk more about some of these issues as we move into market analysis, but changes, basically layoffs and changes in employment opportunities when a business that's a base employment for an area leaves, that can impact a neighborhood or a market area. If you have a government problem, in California had several cities over the last decade that declared bankruptcy. In past decades, counties in California have declared bankruptcies. That has a distressing influence on neighborhoods within that community. And I would say that if you're in an area where redevelopment is occurring, that can distress properties if they are no longer representing the highest and best use. That may distress whatever remaining improvement life there is and bring the property closer to land value. So 3 different types of distress. They're all different, but I would highly illustrate that they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. So my home right now, we had a pretty substantial roof leak. I have a lot of exterior exposed where I've had to rip the insulation out. The OBS siding and the stucco have to come off. I'm going to have to replace some stuff that's dry rot. We bought this house 2 years ago and it had an ongoing leak issue that we weren't aware of. It's stressful. My property is distressed. I'm going to spend a lot of money fixing it. I was distressed. I no longer am. My wife is still distressed. I've resigned myself to part with a lot of money, and I feel better knowing that that's the inevitable outcome. But my property is still distressed, and if I was to attempt to market it in this condition, the distress from that leak would cause my property to suffer some value. No one's going to take that on without measuring the risk and imposing some sort of risk penalty. Makes sense. Let's talk about analyzing a market or a neighborhood. And we typically call things a market, we call things a neighborhood. What we really mean in terms of evidence-based valuation is a competitive market segment. And I think George illustrated all that. I just want to emphasize it. As appraisers or asset analysts, we're supposed to be looking at the market and analyzing it. And I think it's important to remember, I always, for the longest time as an appraiser, have thought, I'm going to put my buyer's hat on as I go out to appraise this property. It doesn't matter what it is that I walk up to. I'm kicking the curb as a potential buyer. And that's really what I'm supposed to be doing, is mimicking the actions of a buyer. And I might do a property inspection a little quicker because we tend to go through a lot of property. But we're basically mimicking the actions of a buyer. And that said, from the eyes of an analyst or appraiser mimicking a buyer, let's look at what we should be doing to determine a competitive market segment. As George says, there's 5 dimensions of similarity that we utilize in evidence-based valuation to get down to properties that are truly competitive in the competitive market segment. I used the word optimal use instead of property type because I think the highest and best use determination is important. I already gave some examples where that may matter. If you're in an area that has some redevelopment, if there's houses in an outlying part of a neighborhood that have a changed zoning, but they're still houses, those may not be part of the competitive market segment. So there's some things to think about there. The rest of these, I think George explained pretty well. Preference elements are characteristics, and we'll look at that as we explore a market to decide, do I want a large house, a small house? How many bedrooms do I want? Do I want a pool? Do I not want a pool? Those are the buyer preferences that we're talking about. So if we look at the traditional valuation methodology, they use some slightly different language for how to analyze a market. But this came out of the last Society of Real Estate Appraisers handbook. They use these 4 words or series of words to describe the 4 factors that you use to analyze a market. The same material is still in the Appraisal of Residential Property, the 4th edition that the Appraisal Institute published. We've just changed the words. Instead of sociological, I think it's trends and something else now, but it's the same thing. And these 4 factors help us to define a market area and or the competitive market segment if we're focused on getting to that. So the physical part is how we define the boundaries of an area, and they can be natural features or they can be man-made boundaries. But we typically are looking at what's the topography. Is there a series of hills or mountains, or is there a cliff that is a natural boundary? Are there roads or highways, major ones usually, that form? Is there a 6-lane road or a freeway that breaks through development? That typically can be a boundary. Rail lines, waterways, lakes, those are all typical physical boundaries or definitions of a market area. Sometimes I think geopolitical boundaries can do that as well. Some of these cross between the 4 factors in my mind. Economic and financial, very important. I have to say, and George already touched on this, there's a lot of talk about bias right now, and that's fine. And nobody should be biased over any particular issue that's prohibited: race, gender, religion, all of those things. However, this is still the methodology that's in the current appraisal textbooks. So I think this stuff matters. It's there. It's been there for forever. And I think if you boil this down, well, why is this here? Because we tend to want to live together with people that are like us. That's just human nature. And I don't think there's anything biased by measuring this and reporting it if it actually influences value. But it's an uphill battle right now, because I know that everybody says you can't be biased as an appraiser. Well, that's a fine line, but I think these things are still very important. The economic and financial conditions are much easier to come by now than they once were. 30 years ago, you would have had to spend a lot of time to get this information. Today, if you're using R, you can plug in APIs to a program interface to go grab this data from various published sources, both government and private, and you can get this information readily, down to census tract levels in some instances. We can measure population trends up and down. Same thing with employment and unemployment. Consumption and spending is an important part of defining a market area. People's disposable income and what they spend it on. And then the vacancy in an area can be a good indicator, especially in a distressed condition. And then also, what's the owner-tenant mix? How many homes in the area are leased versus owner-occupied? Government is another factor that heavily influences a neighborhood. Political stability, I talked already about local government that might declare bankruptcy and go through that. That doesn't lead to stability. Sometimes if the finances of a government agency are inadequate to keep it going, that causes political instability. The governmental layer can be important. If you're in a city that provides a lot of services beyond what a county does in unincorporated areas nearby, if the law enforcement or the planning services or other government services are superior, that can influence the neighborhood. Land use regulations can be a burden. They can also help keep a neighborhood uniform, so they can be a plus or a minus. Same thing with building codes and the enforcement or lack of enforcement. And government ordinances can influence things heavily as well. Rent control, as a typical example. There's other government rules that can influence neighborhoods. Sociological, and this is going to be the one where people start to say bias, but I think this is still very true. So we're going to look at this neighborhood in Walnut Creek that I've focused on before in a past webinar. It's just one I'm very familiar with, and I would just tell you that directly within this neighborhood, but adjacent, there's a very large Japanese cultural center that heavily influences the neighborhoods surrounding it, including the one that we're going to look at. It's a unique resource, and I think it attracts people with Japanese heritage that want to participate in something like that. So that influences the neighborhood. So do other things that are like it. So do religious facilities and schools, particularly ones that might cater to a special, may cater to some other cultural heritage. Those attract people to a neighborhood. And we all want to live with some people that are doing similar things as us. That can include amenities, parks, different recreational opportunities will bring people. These all influence people's decision to locate to a certain area. And the reputation of a neighborhood or a market area or a community can attract people or repel them as well. These are all things that we can actually measure or get information that supports that these have an influence. So analysis of these factors help us define a market area or the competitive market segment, and they can also help us if we're looking at some of the trends, particularly in the economic or financial part, determine whether the market's going up, going down in size, or if it's stable, if it's matured, or if it's in a decline. And this is just general market information. This isn't necessarily a market trend on value. This is the stability of the neighborhood. Once we've identified all that, we can start to look at the real estate market trends with a variety of metrics. And again, I put it in red here because I'm talking market, but I really mean competitive market segment. And it's important, especially as we get into the market analytics and the metrics that we're using. We want to make sure that we're only using truly competitive properties. If we're using properties that a buyer doesn't particularly care about, if buyer's focused on a 1,500 to 1,800 square foot house, and we're including 2,400 and 2,500 square foot homes, that's probably not going to lead us to meaningful results. We'll just go ahead and talk about a lot of these metrics, and we don't always look at these, but we should. There are so many different metrics that can help us identify the direction of a market. Just counting the number of all these different listing types can tell us a lot about the direction of a market. The sales, listings, how many properties were listed but withdrawn or canceled or expired, the number that go pending. And these periods, you can pick a period, you can do monthly, you can, if your market is more limited, maybe quarterly, or even an annual, if you have a long enough period of data, can help you provide meaningful insights. Some of this won't come from your MLS, and some of this will require a lot of digging to determine the number of short sales. If your MLS doesn't report that or isn't 100% accurate, you might have to do a little more research on your own to supplement your data set. Same thing with foreclosures and defaults. The defaults are not going to be in your MLS. These can provide some very useful information about the direction of a market. We can easily calculate a lot of ratios on the second column, the marketing period, ratios of the sale price to the original or the final asking price. If we're counting the number of sales versus the number of listings, we can determine how many sales occur for the number of listings, what that ratio is. And as that changes, that's a great indicator of the direction of the market, whether that's going up or down. And we can always look at the mean or the median prices. Financing is something that we probably should look at. Most markets in America are heavily reliant on financing, and we wipe all that away with, we're assuming that this is cash. But I think we would get very different results in a market if people couldn't get an 80% 30-year fixed loan or other even larger loans. You can get FHA or VHA loans in I said that backwards, FHA or VA loans in many markets, and those don't require a lot down. I think the results would be very different if people paid all cash. One metric that you cannot get is buyer sentiment. And I think this is a very important metric. I have been following John Wake, who's a recovering and nearly retired real estate agent in the greater Phoenix market. And he's kind of become just a real estate analyst. And he publishes some great stuff that I've read on LinkedIn. And when I read it, I'm like, yeah, that's a great point. And he points out that when interest rates began rising early last year, it changed buyer sentiment. And he's, I think, hit on something by saying, effectively, why did people keep buying when these interest rates were hitting negative terms of, well, I think the interest rates bottomed in early 2021 at about 2.65% for the 30-year fixed rate. And he pointed out that people continued to buy because there was this buyer sentiment pervading the market. The values were going to go up forever. And these payments are low and affordable, and it's just going to keep going up. So I'll buy in and I want in on the appreciation. Well, that has ended. And as buyers have realized interest rates will not continue to go down, nor will they likely return to the low levels that they had, buyers have pulled away from the market. And George pointed out in the Miriam Mesa sample, there's a pause. And I think we might be in that pause right now because there's a dearth of sales and pending activity in many markets I look in. So there's no measurement or statistic that you can get on this, but it matters a lot. And perhaps the best way we can measure this is by having our finger on the market and being active in it and talking to agents. I listed my home a couple of years ago when we moved, and my realtor been in the business over 40 years. And he says, well, I'm glad you're getting in now, because he said, my experience in past cycles is that buyers just send a telegraph to each other. When the market is done, they communicate with each other, and it's within a day or two, they just stop showing up. And he said, fortunately for you, that telegraph hasn't gone out yet, but he goes, I'm waiting for it. And that was another indicator to me of buyer sentiment. It matters. And I guess aside from having our finger on the pulse by talking to people who are market participants, the next best way to measure that is just with volume, a big volume decline, or when the market's going to rebound, an upswing. Let's talk about some things that we may not have seen for a while, financing considerations. We've been in a market for many years now where these haven't been a concern or an issue. But as the market conditions deteriorate, we're likely to see more and more creative financing. And if you've not been an appraiser for more than 10 or even 15 years, you may not have seen some of these. I think it's really worth mentioning, and I've already said this, liquidity or just the availability of financing is what I mean by that. It's a strong indicator of where the market's at, which direction it's going, and what kind of distress there is. And I would submit to you that the easy money is slowing and lenders are being more and more restrictive. I would suspect that you will hear calls for, if people have a $300,000 or $400,000 home equity line, at some point they're going to start cutting that. If there's only 50,000 on that line, I think people are going to start to get notices from lenders. Hey, we don't want to extend all this credit to you anymore. Per our terms, we're restricting your credit from 400 to 300,000 or 250. Those are all indicators that the market might be changing. So we're mostly familiar with a fixed rate mortgage. It's fully amortized. We'll look at some amortization schedules in a minute, in a little bit. Used to just be a 15 and a 30 year, but over the last 10 plus years, there's a whole host of terms. You can get other terms. I've listed some here, but I believe you can get just about anything out there. But we still tend to reference the 30 year as the most common. And I would point out that many other countries don't do that. I think for some of the people that are here from Canada, I believe you can only get a much shorter term loan that rolls every 5 years or so. I could be wrong, but this is not the only way it's done throughout the world. And it also used to be that you couldn't get a 30-year loan in America. Early part of last century, that wasn't common. It was a solution that came after the Depression. So we can readily get 30 and 15-year mortgage rates. They're easy to find the quotes. They're ubiquitous. So this chart, I think, is worth talking about for a second. This is, we'll go pull this. This is using this is the quant mod package where we can go to the Fred website and download all kinds of data series that they have. This is just the 30-year US mortgage rate that is quoted each business day. This is the whole series that they have on the Fred website, and it starts in April of 71. And I just added the red lines to show the trends. So in that inflationary period, which was definitely underway in the early 70s until it peaked in 1982, interest rates were on an uptrend. For the last 40 years, they were downtrending. But I believe in February of 2021 is when the low came on the 30-year mortgage rate at 2.65%. I would submit to you from looking at this chart that the uptrend since then is larger than any of the up and down spikes during the 40-year downtrend. And it looks to me like we're in a longer term uptrend. That's my guess. Does this matter? I think it does. Is it likely that interest rates are going to go back down to 2.65 based on that long-term historical trend? Probably not. And this changes things a lot. I think this comes back to buyer psychology. And as buyers tend to absorb this and recognize this, particularly, we hit back to 6.78%, I think, yesterday was the quoted 30-year rate. And I believe the peak here on the right, which dropped a little and it got back down 6 and below, it was in the low 7s. So we're approaching it again. Wouldn't be the least bit surprised to see interest rates move above 7%. This trend matters, I think. So let's just talk about some of the other different types of financing that you might see. Adjustable rate mortgages, something that we didn't see much for the last few years because rates were so low, people wanted to lock them in. A lot of people saved money in decades past by getting an adjustable rate mortgage because the market was going down for interest rates. I'm not sure that these will come back in a big way because, again, I think we might be in a long-term uptrend in interest rates. So this might not be a wise long-term decision. That remains to be seen. I think some important things to remember about this is adjustable rates usually have a benchmark, some sort of a base rate, which could be the prime rate on HELOCs, typically with a 250 basis point spread over that. Or LIBOR was a common one in the past. There's lots of other rate indexes. And then usually these kinds of loans have a minimum and a maximum rate with an 8% spread. So you might get a loan near the low end of it, but you have a lot of upside on what your mortgage payment can grow to with these. Contract to sale is something that I haven't seen for a long time, but in a down market, this is something that can happen. And I believe this varies by state. State law controls some of this, but it's effectively a purchase agreement where a portion of a monthly rent payment is allocated towards a purchase. The structuring of this can vary widely and may vary based on state laws, but it usually can involve some sort of the seller carryback at the end when it's no longer just a contract of sale. And when the financing occurs, it might also involve conventional. But the important part to recognize about this is it may involve non-market financing. So you would have to analyze the difference from whatever terms are in this to what a market financing would be, if that's a 30-year fixed rate or an adjustable, whatever the typical market terms are. A graduated payment mortgage is something that we haven't seen for a long time either. It can have some modifications to the amortization to lower the payment or even postpone it so that there's maybe just interest only and no amortization up front, and it adds to payments in the end of the loan. So there's some time value of money considerations here. It's something we haven't seen, but we may see that again if market conditions continue to deteriorate. Balloon loan, where you just pay interest and the balloon principal is due at the end. This is pretty common. 60, 70 years ago in America, you could get a low loan to value. I think FHA did a 16-year fixed rate loan for up to 50%. And you usually didn't finance that. You paid it off in 16 years. You could get a balloon loan for a 5-year period. You had to be able to pay some of the principal down. You might get a second 5-year, but you wouldn't get a third 5-year. So you became a homeowner in 16 years. We don't really do that. For much of the last few decades, people refinance their home and are perpetual renters. These financing terms matter. Seller financing. Seller financing is a common occurrence, I think, when market conditions suffer, when liquidity is tight and you can't get a bank loan. If you want to sell your property and get the money out of it, this may be one of your only choices. Sometimes seller financing has a low market interest rate, and you have to analyze that. And the net present value of the payment savings is probably going to be representative of a financing terms adjustment. That'll take some analysis. Veterans Administration loans, you can get 100% loan on this. They subsidize some of the costs. They limit some of the closing costs. An adjustment might be applicable depending on these terms. Because if you're not a veteran, you can't get this, and it's a pretty favorable deal. FHA can have pretty high loan to values. Let's talk about a mortgage buy down, because this is something that I think is coming along. I look at a house that's 2 doors from me that just sold. Guy listed it right after the market tanked, the market activity stopped. Listed it at the old price without a reduction. He promptly had, over his 4.5-month marketing period, 14 price reductions. It ultimately sold, and the final sale price was $60,000 above the final asking price, and the sale price was 3 reductions up. It was $60,000 higher than the final asking price. I haven't confirmed it. I haven't met this neighbor yet. They've only been in for about a month, but I really want to ask them, did you get some sort of a mortgage buy down? Because I'm betting they got a pretty good 3-2-1 mortgage buy down, because they financed it, they paid for it. I don't quite understand the attraction to these. These effectively, the seller or an agent or a builder has to fund these. The buyer can't do it. It has to come from a source outside the buyer, and they put money into an escrow that reduces the payments. You can get just a 1-year reduction, a 2 or a 3, and they stair step down typically. The terms vary. You would have to get the terms to be able to make an adjustment for this. We're going to do an example of this later, but I don't understand this, because if the interest rate is 7%, you get a 3%, you get a 3-2-1, you get 3% off the first year, so you're paying 4%, but then your payment goes up to 5% and 6%, and then in the 4th year it goes to the normal for the rest of the loan term, 4%. Well, you're going to make that payment at some point. I guess if you're going to get big income increases, it's fine, but I don't understand why you'd want to pay a higher price to get this. It doesn't make sense to me. This is definitely one where you want to talk to buyer or their agent and get the buyer motivations. Again, we'll come back to this and look at this in a bit. Concessions. So I think this is something that appraisers just typically overlook. Concessions are hard to get. You pretty much have to confirm each sale with the principal to the transaction or their representative. They're not always reported in MLS. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they're not fully reported. And I think some important things to think about when you're looking at these and determining if you need to make an adjustment is it common? If somebody gets a $10,000 non-recurring closing cost credit, is that pretty typical? If that's what the market's doing, maybe you don't need to make an adjustment. Maybe you need to make an adjustment if they didn't get one, if the price doesn't reflect the difference. And the same thing, just the subject get a concession that's half, or is it twice the normal market? We're just looking to make sure that whatever we're seeing with the transaction is typical of the market and not atypical. And I think this is the time where you will start seeing builders in particular who are desperate to keep prices up and profits high. Might include a Mercedes or a BMW or something like that in the garage with a clean title. So if you don't ask about some of these things, you may not find out, and it could matter a lot, because the price of a home with a luxury car in it isn't the same as the price of the home without the luxury car. And again, I think this is just of growing importance right now to verify these terms. This takes some time and effort to do this, because this is hard information to get in most instances. One of the things that I see over and over that is a typical failure in many appraisals is market analysis and improvement analysis. And I think they're very critical to a successful valuation. It's very important to go through and do market analysis. That's really what we're supposed to do. That's what textbooks tell us to do. It's not always what appraisers do. Sometimes we pick a handful of sales that we think subjectively meet the subject property. They may or may not be the best indicators of value, and they certainly don't represent all of the market data that's available. I think it's really important to go through, consider the 5 dimensions of similarity and the 4 factors to define your market correctly, get to the competitive market segment, and then look at your metrics and talk about whether the market's a stable one, it's growing or decreasing, and what the market conditions are for real estate. Are the values going up? Are they down? Are they stable? I think appraisers miss the mark, because what we really should be doing, it's so easy these data visualizations, we can make a box plot or a histogram and show the improvements. We can show the size of the gross living area. We can show the size of the lot. We can show the number of bedrooms that are represented in a bar chart and show how many homes have what and what the distribution is. And then when we do our improvement out, it's real easy, as I've given examples here, to give a description of what is that typical improvement range in this competitive market segment. In the case that we're going to look at with some data, the homes were built in the 60s and 70s. I threw in 15 to 1800. The size in the neighborhood is a little higher. Most of the homes in the neighborhood we're going to look at were 3, 4, and 5 bedrooms. But if this set of circumstances was your typical improvement for the neighborhood range, and you state it that way, when you do your improvement analysis, I think it's really important to talk and give the reader a clear overview of the improvements, but then also tell the reader, are these improvements conforming to the neighborhood range, or are they non-conforming? If that range that we just talked about on the previous page, if your subject is a 1600 3-bedroom home built in 69, it conforms to the typical improvements in the competitive market segment. However, if your subject is larger than that, if it's a 4-bedroom, 3-bath home that's 2,000 square feet and built much later than the typical improvements, you don't have a conforming improvement. And that should set your parameters for looking at what properties are truly competitive. Same thing if you had a property that's much smaller. If you have a 1-bedroom or a 2-bedroom home that's below the square footage of the typical improvements, that should dictate your comp selection. I see a lot of appraisers not do this and then select the conforming improvements and try and adjust their property up or down with size and all these other influences. And I don't think you can get to the right answer with conforming properties and a non-conforming improvement. Pretty straightforward, but most appraisers don't think about this. I just talked about all that. How do we do this graphically? Well, here's from the evaluation sample that I've put up on the website. Here's the improvements on the left, the living area, and the subjects represented in it's in that 3rd quartile. It's in the middle part of the data. It conforms to size. It's at the low end of the lot size, but it conforms. So probably conforming to the market with this property on terms of lot size and living area. And when you look at the bedroom count from this neighborhood, well, we had 4 bedrooms, which is the predominant improvement. We had 3.5 baths. They've added a bathroom. So it's not the most common on the bath size, but it conforms otherwise. So probably what this tells us is their improvements conform to the market with the exception of the bath. So that's something that you should probably make sure that you've dealt with in your comp selection. And again, I'll probably beat that to death, but I think that is a weakness that I see in many appraisals, is not tying those together. And I think it matters a lot, even more when the market's distressed as it is. So this is the Walnut Creek and Concord area. The red circle near the center of the screen is the neighborhood we're about to focus on. I pulled this up this morning. This is a data source that I have access to. It's a First American data product. I think it's a great data visualization. They have the legend up there. There's a lot of sales that are in the green. In the market area we're about to look at, there's only good things. The purple and the green are listings and recent market sales. What's interesting to me to note is there's a lot of other activity in neighborhoods surrounding this. There's a lot of properties that are in default, so 90 days past due to get a notice of default recorded. And First American posts that. It's this really easy visualization to understand. There's some REO properties that are appearing. There's properties that are set for auction, that are past default, that are set for a foreclosure auction. And then there are also some short. Didn't I see a short sale? Maybe I did not. We will see some soon. And then there's occasionally a multiple overlay where the property's got an REO, and then it sells afterwards at a market price. Useful information, very easy to look at, very easy to pick this up. We can do a lot of this with R. That said, let's go take a look at R. Are there some questions that I should address here? Some comments. Okay. Let me go to R and let's look at some data. So first off, let me just go here and let's just take a look at what I did. So I went to this Woodlands neighborhood and I downloaded all of the market transactions from 2005 to present. And I got a lot of data, 500 and something data points. It doesn't tell us much here. This is just raw MLS data, but it's a mix of all the listing types. I pulled up all the expireds, the withdrawns, canceled, all the different sale types. So we have a lot of information here to look through. This doesn't tell us much. Let's go make some sense out of it analytically. So I'm going to go ahead. This is R, as George illustrated. I'm going to go ahead and load some packages. And then I'm going to import that data set. That data set is here in my project folder. And when I pull this in, we have 524 observations of 29 different variables. And we'll keep refining this. So when I import my data, I only import strict numbers. If I need a calculation, I make that myself. I don't rely on what's in MLS, what is in that data. They have days on market, but I go ahead and calculate it myself with simple math. I calculate the sales price ratios as well. And I've taken my MLS reports, full bath and partial bath, and I add them together to get a total bath that we're used to seeing as appraisers. So I'm going to go ahead and mutate those. We now get a second data set, which has the 4 new variables that I just created here. I'm going to also go ahead and make a factor so that we can do some color display with these different listing types. And so when I do that, we now have a factor with each of the listing types that would be available. I'm going to geocode all these properties because my MLS does not have latitude and longitude in it. So we now have the third data set, which added those 2 variables. So we can now map them. I've gone ahead and just, this is everything from 2005 to present. Since we're focused on distress conditions, I've gone to filter the data down to just 2005 through 2013, which was more distressed. So by doing that, I've filtered things to just 240 data points. That's still all the listing types. We can map those now and take a look at those. And this is going to show the color. Let me zoom in on this so that it's easier to read. I didn't make a legend, and I should have, but this is showing us, I think I did orange is the withdrawns, red's expired. The bright green are sales. I don't know why the colors blend, unfortunately, here, because we'll have multiple sales or listings that will have withdrawn or expired, and then it'll sell. So you'll get a blended color. But that's the data. That's where it is. We can go ahead and focus only on the sales and remove the expireds and canceleds. That gives us 53. So of the 240 listing points during this period, during the same period, 53 actually sold in this neighborhood, and we can map those. So there's just less. Let's take a look at some metrics that might help us here. We can make a scatter plot of all these properties. And I did this. This is everything. This is all the way to current. Let me blow this up so that we can see it. But this kind of tells us the trend. And I think this is very useful information when you start to think about this. The olive colored data points are the actual sales, market sales. And this goes with my memory of the market. It was uptrending till about 2006, and then it downtrended. And I think 2011 was probably the bottom, and then things started to go up again. I think you can glean a lot more information than that from this. The expired listings and the withdrawn listings are these. This is withdrawn, the pink, and the more salmon color are expired. What's interesting to note to me is that these seem to be weighted in the upper end of the price range at any given point in time, which tells me maybe those were overpriced. which we would expect. And same thing with the short sales, or the blue, and the darker green are REO sales, and then they kind of fall to the bottom, indicating some distress. And there's plenty of other sales, for whatever reasons, that show a difference between the distress sale and a market sale. We could explore that further and explain that probably. So with that, we can just look at the sales as well in a scatter plot, only during the downturn market. And we get just a little more detail, same kind of trend, same thing. Just useful. The color really helps us see all these different listing transactions and what's going on. We can start to just explore data and make some, we can count, we can look at the number of sales that are occurring each month and year. This gets hard to see because of the scale. Notice that not every month has a sale. And the most number of sales in any month in this market is 3 during this period. 1 is much more typical. Tells us something. How about looking at the listings by month and year during the same time period? There's more listings. More months have a listing. Some months have quite a few. Gives us the trend. If we were to compare the number of listings each month to the number of sales, that ratio would tell us a direction of the market as well. I didn't make that chart, but we could. Properties that are going pending in any month, we can just look at each of these metrics and see what the market activity is doing. Days on the market and the trends. Just tells us the average of all the sales. And so some months there's only 1, others there's more. This is a market that's small enough, it might be more meaningful to look at quarters or even annual here. I just did all these monthly, but they could easily be modified to show another period. We can do the same thing with the sales price to the asking price. These are just shown as off of a 0 being up 100% of the asking price. And it's the percent over or under. Clearly, market was downtrending, but 2006, nothing was selling over asking price. And then we see that the market probably bottomed in 2011, and we started getting offers over the asking price again by 2012. You can do the same thing. That was the original price. This is the final asking price. So a little bit higher on the end, it looks like. Maybe not, a little bit. We could do the same thing by looking at the average or mean sale price. This is just a scatter plot of those monthly averages, and that's going to show us the trend. We could add a trend line here as well. Median price, sometimes there's not enough data to have a meaningful number there. It's just going to give us the one transaction. Let's go ahead. I can just run this. Let's just take a look at it when it's all finished in a larger, we can look at it on a web browser and see the bigger picture. This is just running, and in a moment, we're going to get an HTML document. And there it is. So our maps, I've left a lot of the code in because these are just worksheets. We have a great file here, though. If you customize this to what you need, awful lot of info can be gleaned from the market, and you have a work file that you can customize this to each job. But once you have some of this base code, it's really easy to work with it and customize it for each job. Let's go take a look at addressing some financing issues. I see other questions. John's correcting me. John, you should just speak over me because I'll make bonehead mistakes. That's okay. Thank you, by the way. So let's talk about some financing adjustments and how do we do that? And I'm going to post all this stuff on the community of asset analyst forum. And if you want to use this code, feel free to modify it for your own use. So I've just set up here some parameters for looking at mortgage terms. I have dates, the loan amount, just interest rates, and things that are going to be needed to do some amortization terms a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and load these packages because there's a couple packages that weren't in the last markdown document. I'm going to go ahead and clean all this out just because it'll be easy for us to see what we're doing here. So I've run all that. We can use the QuantMod package to go grab data from the Federal Reserve in St. Louis. I put the website in there. They have like hundreds of thousands of different data series in here. And this is all that it takes. I've loaded the package. You use the term get symbols and you tell it what symbol you want. And what you have to do here is go to the Federal Reserve website, which is right here, and tell it the 30-year fixed mortgage rate is mortgage 30 US. And you tell it the source is from Fred, and tell it that I'm just telling it here, return the class. It's an extensible time series. And that's how R handles time series. So we do that. And then I tell it simply we'll plot this data series that we have. And I added a label and told it I want the trend line to be blue. So when I do that, we get this chart that I put in. I added some edits as an image. I tried to add a trend line. It's not as easy. I tried to add the red arrows. It's not as easy as you might think in R. It can be done, but you have to add some coordinate points. And I just didn't feel like taking the time to do it, but it could be done. Is this a useful tool? Yeah, there are so many different, there are hundreds of different mortgage indexes and rates that are tracked in time series there. All of the different public and private data sources that publish info on unemployment. So just simple code like that, you can pull these charts into your report. And if you just want to save this, you just click Save Image As or copy the image. You can paste this into a forms report or into a narrative report. Very easy to use this stuff. There's so much data available. As I said, going back to the defining the 4 factors and the 5 dimensions of similarity, this data is readily available. It's easy to use. Appraisers should probably be looking at this. I know mortgage lending work for residential properties isn't going to pay you to do that. But if you're going to do work outside that arena, your fee may need to be adjusted to incorporate some of this if this matters to your client. Some clients will be willing to pay for this. Let's take a look at making some adjustments for financing conditions. So we can use another package, which I didn't load above. I need to load it here. It's the financial math package, and I'm turning scientific notation off here. Now that that's loaded, with the info that I put up above here, I've got dates for when the loan starts, what the loan term is, the loan amount. It's a 30-year loan term. And I've put in 2 interest rates. And then this is the rest of the calculations monthly, basically, for how it's calculating things. So now that we have those, I'm using parameters, which is that data set that we set in the header. And this is each of those, the term, the loan balance, the rate, and then ICMPF for how it's calculating monthly. So if we do this, we'll get an amortization table. And this is on a $500,000 loan for the first, we're using rate 1. So this is a 2.75% mortgage. So at the bottom of the market 2 years ago, this is what an amortization table would look like for that monthly payment of $2,041 a month. And note that we're up about 400 basis points approximately from that. And that's the second interest rate. It has all the other terms the same, but the second interest rate is approximating today's mortgage rate of 6.75 for a 30-year fixed. And when we do this one, a payment's gone up a lot. It's gone from $20.41 to $32.42 a month. That's pretty heavily impacted by our psychology. We don't have to calculate all of these. If you don't need the amortization table, the beauty of this is we can go ahead and calculate the difference between these two just with using R, and we can capture some of the information that we need, like the payment, because that's if you notice here, the payment, this is the number of months, which isn't part of the data that it kicks out. But the payment amount is the second part of the vector that's calculated in the amortization. So we can call that by saying we want the second item of the vector, and then I'm making it monthly by dividing by 12. So we can go ahead and calculate those two payments, and we save them to a variable. So now we have those to work with. And we can use this for any variety of, if you have this would be an easy way to calculate the seller financing. You put in whatever the finance rate is that the seller's charging and the amortization terms, and you go get the market one. If the market is a 30-year fixed rate at the current quoted rate, the difference is calculated between these two payments. So now that we have calculated those two payments, it's just simple math to figure out the difference. And we can use all these to determine what the percent difference between the payments is. We could calculate a whole variety of other information about it as well, if we're trying to measure for an adjustment. How about on a mortgage rate buy down? Let's take a look at that. Let's just do a 2-1, which would be 2% off the first year, 1% off the second year from the market rate, and then at the end of the second year and the beginning of the third year, the borrower is going to end up paying the full market rate. So I'm going to use rate 2, which is the 6.75%, which is roughly today's market. And so what we need to do is take that rate from the parameters. This is the 6.75, and we're going to subtract 2% from it for the first year. That'll be the rate in year 1. And then we'll subtract 1% to get the rate in year 2. And then after that, we'll just measure what the term rate is for the remainder. So, and there we get it. 6.75 was the actual market. I think I did these backwards. Let's fix that.
That's right, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it is right. Thank you.
It is right.
Thank you. Yep, it stair steps up. So the second year is getting closer to it. So now that we have those, we calculated those rates. And remember, to reuse this, all you need to do, if you have a 3, 2, 1, all you would do is add year 3, and this would change to 3, 2, and 1, and you'd calculate that third rate and add another line here. We're going to go ahead and calculate the difference. We're using that amortization that I just showed above. And we're pulling all of the loan terms from year 1 from the parameters set above for the number of months, the loan amount, and then we're using, for the interest rate, we're using this variable that we just set for year 1. So it'll go ahead and calculate that, and it'll give us the monthly payment. And we're doing the same thing for the second year and for the, I called it loan terms all for the whole thing. And then we're back to using the rate from the parameter, which is 6.75. So we can go ahead, calculate this, and it's going to give us all of the things that we need to calculate the total cost of this buy down to approximate an adjustment. So we have the monthly payments for each one of these now. We've set all these to variables. This would be the total payment at the end in the third year. This is the reduced payments in years 1 and 2. So if we take these, calculate the difference between the final payment and the reduced payments for each year and multiply it by 12, that's the total costs or savings, I should say, in the buy down. And the buy down cost is just those two savings added together without consideration for the time value of money. So if we run that, we get the buy down cost is $12,344. And so we can now take that, because this is a variable, we can use some inline code to pull that. And I used the scales package to set it as a dollar amount. So now if we go ahead and knit this, and I just set it up this way as an example, we could easily just type that variable name buy down costs on the last line, and it would print it out for us. But now I have all of this worksheet, and I didn't turn anything off. So we see all the code here as well, how to build the mortgage rate chart, and it's going to give us the amortization tables. We could turn those off if we don't want them in our file. Just an example, but here now we have the mortgage rate buy down calculation. And goes through, we show how we did all of it, and it's telling us flat out the total cost of this buy down that was paid by probably the seller, has to be someone other than the buyer. The cost was $12,344.06 without consideration of any time value of money. There might be a net present value that's lower, that it possibly could be put into a trust account at the lender with some interest credit. And we might want to address that, we might not. It might not matter. The net present value of that for 2 years might not be that big of a deal. We might round it to 12,500 or 12,000. But anyway, that's how you calculate it. Once you have this code, it's reusable. All you have to do is change the one interest rate. And you could set up a code for a 1-0, a 2-1, or a 3-2-1 buy down. Reusable each time. That is mostly what I had laid out. Questions, comments? I would say too, before we go there, there's some rough code here to do all kinds of adjustments. It's not complicated, but it's really easy in R to build this stuff and make a template that's reusable. Solve your problem once and it works over and over. And then you could build a table with this too that would show and demonstrate how you've calculated it. Questions or comments?
I haven't had any questions in a bit. And John took care of the ones that we had.
Okay. Yeah, I think my high fly on this was fast, but I would also just say that all these are important to sit back and look at, and you have to be that as an analyst, you have to sit back and decide what's the market doing? How would I account for this? Is this atypical or is it typical? And what is the difference in motivation and how do I represent that? Does it need an adjustment or not? And I guess my final comment is that some of these financial things probably are more likely to require an adjustment than anything else. Market conditions and the financing differences. But when we use the evidence-based valuation, I think it's really important to highlight that a lot of the adjusting that we do to our data to get the right data set gets us to an indicated range for the market segment. And we may not need to make a lot of adjustments like we're typically doing when we have a handful of subjective sales. But these might be the exception where we can calculate some financial differences. That is what I had. It's a fast pass. I would just say be on the watch for a lot of this. I think it's coming if it isn't here already.
All right, I don't see any questions.
Anybody, they can raise their hand if they have questions. Otherwise,
So John Ferris is strictly a residential appraiser, and I know now uses R nothing but R, right, for your residential appraiser. You want to share for just a couple of minutes?
Sure, I'll share for a couple of minutes. So I rarely ever open Excel unless I need to add in some data like new construction or MLS has got a bunch of blanks for living areas. So I just use Excel to fill in the blanks and then run everything through R after that. Actually, this morning I got a great revision request for this is for a builder who's refinancing a model property, and they didn't like that I used negative time adjustments.
Oh,
So
no.
they started quoting some, well, you know, the month over month average sale price in January is the same as it was in December. And they even included a little graph, but the little graph went like this and then came back down. And here's January and here's December. I said, they're the same. Why are you using time adjustments? I said, all my comps for up here. That's why I'm using time adjustments. And I just, referred them back to the charts I already had in the report, and I referred them back to their own listing of that model property, which has been on market for 145 days with multiple price reductions. Like you guys have already reduced your property, the market's coming down. So being able to put in these types of graphs and document that data and I also added in a little extra one for them, which was on concessions, which, you know, just did a scattered plot of concessions by time and just put in a trend line and watched how concessions are going up. Supply is going up, sales are going down. Like, what more proof do you need that you know, the market is going down? And I want to point out that that data set that they use with the average sale prices was for the entire county, not just for their market, but it's for the entire county. It's like, yeah, we're not the same. There's a lot of places in the county that are much more affordable, and those affordable homes are still going up in some markets, but and that affects those median and average prices, monthly prices for an entire county. So you can't just use a county, even an entire city. You got to get down to that competing market segment.
You know, I think you just highlighted a really important metric that I didn't mention. And just as when the market was in a complete frenzy and going up, realtors were reporting on my MLS the number of offers, not always accurately, but sometimes they report, I think I saw 18 offers on one property once. Many times there were multiple. Right now, I think probably very useful to take a look at sales and count the number of price reductions before a sale occurred, because that's very indicative of market conditions. Not probably readily determinable mathematically without going and pulling the history and counting. I don't think MLS has a reporting of that, but that's a telling indicator.
Yeah, I thought that was great, just to give them back their own listing and say, you guys know you're lying. Look, here's your own listing. You've reduced it 5 times. You know it's not selling at that price.
Yeah, I have to add too, I review a lot of appraisals, both residential and commercial. I see a lot of appraisers using time adjustments, but I see just as many not reporting declining market conditions. And when I read through their reports, they don't do what I talked about. They don't tie it all together. In many areas of the report, they're going to tell me a lot of things that talk about how the market's weakening. And they're probably not realizing that they're setting themselves up to say, yeah, the market's declining and they should be adding in the market conditions adjustments down. But for whatever reason, they're timid or frightened to do it. And I think that comes back to what I talked about, this overriding importance of tying all these factors together, the market, the property, and if the market's declining, tell the reader and indicate it. And if market conditions adjustment downward are necessary, feel free to do them. If you've got the information that supports it, don't be timid. I'm seeing a lot of that. And in fact, I'm calling people and saying, hey, did you think about, and there's usually a reply of, well, yeah, and that I'm timid to do it is effectively the answer. So if you can support it, do it.
Okay, well, it looks like we have no questions. You know, I suspect we're going to need to do this webinar or something like this again 6 or 8 months from now, when it really hits home how much we're going to have at REOs and buybacks and all kinds of stuff. Any feedback any of you are willing to give us on this webinar or anything that we do, where we're just trying to be of service here. Obviously, the stats, graphs, and data science class is a fundamental to just about everything we do here. Modernized appraisal, and that's coming down the pike too. Fannie and Freddie and the VA are all moving this direction. The old form of reports is just going away. It's going to be dashboards that adapted to the particular user, whether it's a reviewer, underwriter, manager, portfolio manager, risk analyst. They'll all have different dashboards. Our job is delivering an enhanced data stream.
Hey, George,
Yes,
I'd like to throw something out. For
absolutely.
anybody here who's in a market that is still going up, watch what's going on elsewhere. It eventually shows up. So here in California, we've lost hundreds of thousands of residents, 500,000, I believe, in the last couple of years. They're going to North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas, and so forth. And there's probably more buyers than sellers. It's a seller's market. But eventually, you'll probably see what we're seeing. In fact, one of the problems with Californians and New Yorkers and so forth moving into these other areas, it makes those homes unaffordable to the people who are already there. So what you're going to see, George mentioned earlier, is all of a sudden, you're not going to see prices going down. You're just going to see properties sitting on the market a little bit longer, maybe price reductions. You see all these things before you actually see prices going down that can be measured. So this is that gap period that George was talking about earlier. So it's coming. Eventually, depends on interest rates. Of course, always watch the population change, household income, things like that. Those are not available in the MLS, but they're available elsewhere.
I think that's a great point, Craig. I think I would add to that, though. Watch liquidity, because I think lenders are already constricting what's available, and I think you're going to see that trend accelerate. I can't imagine who'd want to be investing. I think that's the problem. If you look at the bond market right now, nobody wants to buy a 20 or a 30-year bond or T-bill in a rising interest rate environment, because it's not a good investment. And I think the same thing is true with loans. In a rising interest rate environment, who wants to buy a 30-year fixed loan at a still relatively low rate? One of the things I didn't talk about, but I think it's very important, is inflation is still trending along at 6-point-something% with the CPI that just got released last week. Mortgage interest rates are kind of on par with it. So interest rates are effectively zero for 30-year fixed in real terms, inflation adjusted. That's not, there needs to be some premium for risk before the market is a healthy one. So I know all these trends are very important, and I'm going to bet that something changes there. I wouldn't be the least bit surprised to see mortgage rates come to some sort of positive real term before too long, but those will all impact markets.
I mentioned one more thing. So some of us were doing this back in the 70s. We saw this. In fact, some people here have probably never seen interest rates go up, but I was from the 70s through the 80s, and it went from 9.5 up to roughly 18% or so, 16, 18% and 81, 82. And it was interesting at that time, and lenders were in trouble, SNLs went broke and so forth following this. But the mantra was from all lenders, we will never, ever make a long-term fixed rate loan again. We'll never do it again. And what have we had for the last 30 years? 30-year fixed rate loans. What are the value of those loans that are on the books now? The GSEs and so forth. They got rates of 3%. What is the value of that loan?
I think that's another great point, but I don't think you finished it. And 30 years ago, most loans were held. They were portfolio loans. But we financialized everything in America, and now we securitize all those loans. And there's a 6 to a 9 month hold period for the GSE or for any lender that's doing those before they can securitize them and sell them off. And individual investors are buying little slivers of each one. And if there's a 1% or less default rate, no individual investor really feels much pain because it's just spread. But those products aren't tested heavily in a down market. They didn't end well last time. I don't know. That might not end well.
One more thing. I do a lot of fraud work, litigation, and so forth. I see what I'm looking at appraisals, appraisers that are being sued and so forth. But, and I've seen much of this over the years, if you're stating that prices are stable and prices are declining, and the property you appraise goes into default, they're looking for somebody to go after. And so the stuff that Bruce is teaching, George is teaching, don't call a market stable when it's going down, make negative market change adjustments. John Ferris had one where they didn't like hearing that. And by the way, there are appraisers in the 80s when things were going down, appraisers were stating stable. They ended up getting sued and some big payoffs or payouts. So look at risk. If you're asked to remove that, or to change it. So I'm glad to see John left it in. I have measured all of Southern California price trend. Yes, I lumped everything together, but I divided it into homes and condos. Every single county in Southern California, probably mid and central too, have gone down since about April, May, June. Every single market peaked. Well, every county. There are sub-markets within that are doing better, but every single county peaked and has been subsequently declining.
All right, thank you very much. Next month, we do have Steve Smith here. We'll be talking about how to get out of loan appraisals and get into other types of appraisals. We may have Bruce help out with that a little bit, maybe somebody else. In the month after that, we're going to be talking about the very thing Craig just talked about, the risk. And certainly we hope that you start using our price indexing model that we've been teaching. You get that set up, you can do it in a matter of seconds, and then you're never lying again because you're just showing what the data does.
So
Unless
John
there's
just
one-
forwarded me one more question.
Okay.
Do I see non-performing loan sales increasing? My inside view from working on a contract basis with the lender is non-performing loans are increasing dramatically. I don't think that's public knowledge. And I think it's very interesting. And I think it goes back to market analysis and the need. I think a lot of businesses are experiencing, I think consumers are starting to slow their spend because I think consumers have a crude understanding that things are changing and not for the better financially. They're looking at layoffs, they're looking at all these things. And I'm startled by watching businesses that have been around 20 or 30 years that are established defaulting or not, either not making their own payment or defaulting by only being able to make part of their mortgage payment on their real estate that they house their business in, a restaurant or something that's been there for forever. So yeah, and that's a great question because that's an important barometer too. If you can get your hand on that information, and I'm seeing more and more news articles, real estate. You should be subscribing to a lot of real estate emails or just people have the distribution list or visiting websites that are real estate specific. And I keep seeing on the CMBS, especially for commercial loans, the defaults that are coming, particularly in the office sector for non-performing assets. So yeah, that's a great question. And it's another indicator to look at. We didn't talk about it, but it's a good one. And that will create distressed market conditions for certain property types when enough loans go bad. I think it's worth talking about here, a company called Veritas Investments in San Francisco. This is all public now. They were the buzzard that was plucking the meat from the bones in 2008. They were in San Francisco investing in distressed multifamily properties, and they bought all kinds of things at deep bargain prices. Well, in November, although it was just released in the last few weeks publicly, they defaulted on, they bought all of these apartments and they kept levering up in the up market, and they got too much leverage. And in San Francisco, a market that's had a lot of companies leave, rising unemployment there, and just declining market livability for all kinds of things that are in the news. Some of their properties had 30% vacancy due to all those factors. They defaulted on $450 million of CMBS on 60-something properties and 1,700 apartment units. They just turned the keys back because the vacancies were up, expenses are up, inflation was eating them, the cost of debt service was up. They didn't pencil to refinance their existing debt. So they gave the keys back to the lender on all that. What do you think that does? That's a 1,700 units of apartments in one market. That causes distress immediately when those get sold at a discount. So yeah, I think those are news items to be watching because there's a lot of information available about that. And those trends aren't going to stop. Good question.
Okay, last chance. Thank you all for being here. Same place, same time. Tune in next month for some more depressing news. Thank you.
Well, it's not that bad. Remember,
Learn how to handle it. That's the point of all this.
remember,
Learn how to handle it.
demand for us goes up when things are distressed. It's not all bad.
Thank you all very much. Have a good day.
Bye.
Thanks, Bruce.